Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
The legendary story of John Rambo is far from over, and if the rumors, leaks, and growing speculation are anything to go by, Rambo 6 in 2026 might be the most intense and emotional chapter we've ever seen in the franchise. For decades, the character of Rambo has stood as a symbol of survival, trauma, war, and redemption, and now the question is not just whether he will return, but what kind of world he will return to, and whether that world has any place left for a man like him. After the brutal and deeply personal events of the last installment, many fans believed that Rambo's story had finally reached its end. The closing moments felt like a farewell, almost like the final chapter of a warrior who had nothing left to fight for. But Hollywood has a long history of bringing back its most iconic heroes, and Rambo is not just any hero. He represents an era, a mindset, and a raw, unfiltered version of action storytelling that modern cinema rarely dares to explore. The biggest talking point surrounding Rambo 6 is the return of the legendary actor who defined the role for decades. Even at an older age, the idea of seeing Rambo back in action creates a powerful sense of nostalgia mixed with curiosity. Fans are asking, will this version of Rambo still be the unstoppable force we remember, or will the story shift toward a more grounded, emotional, and reflective narrative? The answer might be a combination of both, which is exactly what makes this project so exciting. In terms of story direction, early discussions and speculation suggest that Rambo 6 will move away from simple revenge-driven plots and instead dive deeper into themes like legacy, consequences, and the psychological toll of a lifetime of violence. This time, the conflict may not just be external enemies, but internal battles that Rambo has been carrying for years. The idea is to present a character who is no longer just fighting to survive, but trying to understand whether his past actions have created more destruction than justice. The setting of the film is expected to expand beyond the isolated environments we've seen before. While previous movies often placed Rambo in jungles, small towns, or border regions, this installment might introduce a more global scale. There are strong hints that the story could involve international conflict, possibly tied to modern warfare, private military groups, or underground criminal networks that operate across borders. This shift would allow the film to feel fresh while still maintaining the gritty tone that defines the franchise. One of the most interesting elements being discussed is the possibility of a new generation of characters being introduced alongside Rambo. This could mean a younger soldier, a survivor, or even someone directly impacted by Rambo's past actions. The dynamic between these characters could become the emotional core of the film. Instead of just focusing on action, the story might explore mentorship, guilt, and the idea of passing on knowledge, or warning others not to follow the same path. When it comes to the cast, while nothing is officially confirmed, expectations are that the film will combine familiar faces with new talent. The return of key supporting characters, if handled correctly, could add depth and continuity to the story. At the same time, introducing new actors would help bring a modern edge to the film, making it appealing to both longtime fans and a younger audience. The casting choices will be crucial because they will determine whether the film feels like a natural continuation or just another reboot. The action style of Rambo 6 is another major point of discussion. The franchise has always been known for its raw, brutal, and realistic approach to combat. Unlike many modern action films that rely heavily on CGI, Rambo movies have traditionally focused on practical effects, intense physical performances, and grounded violence that feels real and impactful. Fans are hoping that this approach will continue, but with an updated cinematic style that enhances the experience without losing authenticity. Another aspect that could define the film is its tone. While earlier Rambo films balanced action with emotional storytelling, the later installments leaned more toward darker and more violent themes. Rambo 6 has the opportunity to strike a perfect balance between these elements. It can deliver the intense action sequences that fans expect while also providing a meaningful narrative that adds depth to the character. This balance is what could elevate the film from just another action sequel to a powerful cinematic experience. The plot itself is being kept tightly under wraps, but several theories have emerged based on the direction of the previous film. One popular theory suggests that Rambo could be drawn back into conflict after someone from his past reappears, bringing with them a threat that cannot be ignored. This could be a former enemy, a lost ally, or even a situation connected to his earlier missions. The idea is to create a story that feels personal, where the stakes are not just global but deeply emotional. Another possibility is that the film could explore the consequences of Rambo's actions in a more direct way. Instead of simply facing new enemies, he might have to deal with the fallout of decisions he made years ago. This approach would add a layer of complexity to the story, making it more than just a fight for survival. It would become a journey of accountability and reflection, something that has rarely been explored in action franchises at this level. The release date for Rambo 6 is still uncertain, but speculation points toward a potential 2026 release window. This timing would make sense from a production standpoint, allowing enough time to develop a strong script, assemble the right cast, and ensure that the film meets the high expectations of fans. Given the legacy of the franchise, there is a lot of pressure to get everything right, and rushing the project would not be a wise decision. As for the trailer, while no official footage has been released, fans are already imagining what it might look like. A typical Rambo trailer would likely start with a slow, emotional build-up, showing glimpses of Rambo's current life, followed by a sudden shift into intense action sequences. Explosions, hand-to-hand combat, and powerful dialogue would create a sense of urgency and excitement. The trailer would need to capture both the emotional weight of the story and the adrenaline-pumping action that defines the series. Overall, Rambo 6 has the potential to be more than just another sequel. It could serve as a final chapter, a passing of the torch, or even a redefinition of what the Rambo legacy truly means. The key will be finding the right balance between honoring the past and embracing the future. If done correctly, this film could become one of the most memorable entries in the franchise, leaving a lasting impact on both fans and the action genre as a whole. As the anticipation for Rambo 6 continues to grow, the deeper layers of what this film could represent begin to unfold in even more compelling ways. This is not just about another mission, another war, or another enemy. This is about the closing weight of a lifetime filled with conflict, and the kind of story that forces both the character and the audience to confront everything that came before. One of the most powerful directions the film could take is exploring the idea that Rambo is no longer chasing fights, but fights keep finding him. This shift changes everything. Instead of a man actively stepping into war, we see someone trying to stay away from it, someone who has already paid the price many times over. But when violence follows you, when your past refuses to stay buried, the line between choice and destiny starts to disappear. And that's where the emotional core of this story becomes incredibly strong. There are strong possibilities that the film may begin with Rambo living in isolation once again, perhaps even more disconnected than before. The quiet life he once tried to build may feel fragile, almost temporary, like something that could break at any moment. And when the conflict finally arrives, it won't just disrupt his peace. It will challenge everything he believes about himself. Is he still the same man? Or has time finally changed him in ways even he doesn't fully understand? Another fascinating angle being discussed is the introduction of a character who mirrors Rambo's younger self. This could be a soldier, a victim, or even someone caught in a war they never chose to be part of. Through this character, the film could reflect on Rambo's journey in a deeply emotional way that it's not just about teaching survival skills. It's about confronting the consequences of living a life defined by violence. The relationship between these two characters could become the heart of the story, adding layers of meaning that go far beyond action. At the same time, the antagonist of Rambo 6 is expected to be very different from previous enemies. Instead of a single villain, the threat could come from an organized system, something larger, more complex, and harder to destroy. This could involve private military forces, global crime syndicates, or even corrupt networks operating in the shadows. The idea here is to create an enemy that cannot simply be defeated with brute force, forcing Rambo to adapt, think differently, and face a challenge that tests him on every level. This evolution in storytelling would naturally lead to a different kind of action. While the film is still expected to deliver intense combat sequences, the focus may shift toward strategy, survival, and psychological tension. Instead of constant explosions and large-scale battles, we could see more controlled, calculated moments of violence, scenes that feel quieter but hit much harder. This kind of approach would not only keep the film grounded, but also make every action sequence feel meaningful and necessary. The emotional depth of the story could also be enhanced by exploring Rambo's memories. Flashbacks, or even subtle references to past events, could remind the audience of everything he has been through. These moments would not just serve as nostalgia, but as a way to connect the past with the present, showing how every decision, every battle, and every loss has shaped the man he is today. It's this continuity that could give Rambo 6 a sense of finality, as if everything is leading to one last defining moment. There is also growing speculation that this film could introduce a theme of redemption, not in the traditional sense, but in a more personal and introspective way. Rambo may not be trying to save the world or even prove anything to others. Instead, he could be searching for a way to make peace with himself. This journey could involve protecting someone, stopping a threat, or simply ensuring that the cycle of violence does not continue through the next generation. When it comes to the film's structure, it's likely that the pacing will play a crucial role. A slow, atmospheric beginning could set the tone, allowing the audience to reconnect with the character and understand his current state of mind. As the story progresses, the tension would gradually build, leading to a series of intense and emotionally charged moments. The final act, if executed correctly, could deliver a powerful combination of action and storytelling that leaves a lasting impact. The climax of the film is perhaps the most important aspect, and there are several ways it could unfold. One possibility is a final confrontation where Rambo must face not just his enemy, but everything he represents. This could be a moment where physical strength alone is not enough, where the outcome depends on choices, sacrifices, and the ability to let go of the past. Another possibility is a more symbolic ending, something that focuses less on victory and more on closure. Fans are also wondering whether Rambo 6 will truly be the last chapter. While nothing is officially confirmed, the tone and direction being discussed strongly suggest that this film could serve as a conclusion to the story. However, that doesn't necessarily mean the end of the franchise. By introducing new characters and expanding the narrative, the film could open the door for future stories set in the same universe. Even if Rambo himself is no longer at the center, the trailer, whenever it is released, will play a major role in shaping audience expectations. A well-crafted trailer could instantly capture attention by combining emotional storytelling with glimpses of high-intensity action. It might begin with silence, showing Rambo in a moment of reflection before slowly building towards scenes of chaos and conflict. The use of music, dialogue, and pacing will be critical in creating a sense of anticipation without revealing too much of the plot. Visually, the film is expected to maintain the gritty and realistic style that the franchise is known for, but with a more modern cinematic approach. Lighting, camera work, and sound design could all contribute to creating a more immersive experience. Every scene, whether it's a quiet conversation or a violent encounter, would need to feel authentic and grounded. This attention to detail is what could set Rambo 6 apart from other action films. Another important factor is how the film handles its legacy. Rambo is not just a character. He's a symbol of a certain type of storytelling that has evolved over time. The challenge for this film is to honor that legacy while also adapting to the expectations of modern audiences. This means balancing classic elements with new ideas, ensuring that the story feels both familiar and fresh at the same time. As discussions continue and excitement builds, one thing becomes increasingly clear. Rambo 6 is not just about action, it's about meaning. It's about understanding what it costs to live a life defined by conflict, and whether it's ever possible to truly leave that life behind. These are themes that resonate on a deeper level, giving the film the potential to connect with audiences in a way that goes beyond entertainment. And perhaps the most powerful aspect of all is the idea that even after everything, even after all the battles and losses, there is still a story left to tell. Whether it ends in peace, sacrifice, or something in between, the journey of John Rambo continues to hold a unique place in cinematic history. Because some legends don't just fade away, they leave behind a final chapter that defines everything that came before. When we look beyond the surface of Rambo 6, what makes this potential film truly powerful is not just the action or the story. It's the legacy it carries and the expectations attached to it. This is a franchise that defined an era of cinema, and now it stands at a crossroads where it can either repeat the past or evolve into something far more meaningful. One of the most intriguing possibilities is that Rambo 6 might not follow a traditional linear narrative. Instead, the film could experiment with a more reflective structure, where the present timeline is constantly interrupted by fragments of the past. These moments wouldn't just be flashbacks. They would feel like memories haunting Rambo, shaping his decisions in real time. This approach would allow the audience to experience his psychological state in a much deeper way, almost as if they are inside his mind. Imagine a scene where Rambo is preparing for a confrontation, and instead of rushing into action, the film slows down. We see flashes of previous battles, voices from the past, echoes of decisions that changed lives forever. These aren't just reminders, they're burdens. And in that moment, the audience realizes that the real battle isn't happening in front of him, but within him. This kind of storytelling could elevate the film far beyond a standard action sequel. Another powerful direction could be the concept of consequence versus survival. Throughout the franchise, Rambo has always survived. No matter how impossible the situation, he finds a way. But what if this time, survival is not the ultimate goal? What if the story challenges the idea that surviving is enough? This shift would add a completely new dimension to the character, forcing him to confront whether simply staying alive is worth the cost of everything he has lost. There's also a strong possibility that the film could explore moral ambiguity in a way the series hasn't fully done before. Instead of clearly defined heroes and villains, we might see a world where every side believes they are justified. This would make the conflict far more complex and realistic. Rambo, who has always operated on instinct and experience, would now have to navigate a situation where the lines between right and wrong are blurred. This kind of narrative opens the door for intense, dialogue-driven moments. While the franchise is known for action, some of its most memorable scenes come from silence and emotion. Rambo 6 could lean into this strength, giving us scenes where tension is built through conversation, eye contact, and unspoken understanding rather than constant movement. These quieter moments could make the action sequences even more impactful when they finally happen. Another layer that could be explored is the idea of identity. After years of being defined as a soldier, a fighter, and a survivor, who is Rambo without conflict? This question could become central to the story. If the film truly aims to conclude his journey, it needs to answer not just what he does, but who he is. And that answer might not be simple or comfortable. There are also theories suggesting that the film could include a symbolic passing of the torch, but not in the way most franchises do. Instead of creating a direct replacement for Rambo, the story might focus on the idea that his experiences should not be repeated. In other words, the next generation doesn't need another Rambo. They need something better. This would be a bold and meaningful message, aligning with the deeper themes of reflection and growth. From a cinematic perspective, the film could push boundaries in how it presents action. Instead of relying solely on scale, it could focus on perspective. For example, a single combat sequence could be shown from multiple angles, not just visually, but emotionally. We see what Rambo feels, what the opponent feels, and even the impact on the environment around them. This layered approach would make each moment feel more immersive and significant. Sound design could also play a crucial role in shaping the experience. Silence, in particular, could be used as a powerful tool. Imagine moments where all sound drops out, leaving only the character's breathing or heartbeat. This kind of detail would pull the audience deeper into the scene, making them feel every second of tension. As for the ending, this is where the film has the opportunity to truly define itself. There are several directions it could take, and each one carries its own emotional weight. One possibility is an ending that focuses on peace, not as a reward, but as a hard-earned state of acceptance. Another possibility is a more ambiguous conclusion, leaving the audience to interpret what Rambo's journey ultimately means. There's also the chance that the film could take a bold risk and deliver an ending that challenges expectations entirely. Instead of a traditional resolution, it could leave certain questions unanswered, reflecting the reality that not every story has a clear conclusion. This kind of ending would spark discussion, keeping the film relevant long after its release. The impact of Rambo 6, if executed correctly, could extend beyond the franchise itself. It could influence how action films approach storytelling, proving that even the most iconic characters can evolve and explore deeper themes. In an industry often driven by spectacle, this kind of film would stand out by offering substance alongside intensity. And then there's the audience, the fans who have followed this journey for decades. For them, this isn't just another movie. It's the continuation of a story they've grown up with, a character they've connected with, and a legacy they've watched unfold over time. Meeting those expectations is not an easy task, but it's also what makes this project so important. At its core, Rambo 6 has the potential to be more than just entertainment. It can be a reflection on violence, survival, and the human condition. It can ask questions that don't have easy answers, and in doing so, create a viewing experience that stays with the audience long after the credits roll. Because in the end, the story of Rambo isn't just about war, it's about what war leaves behind. It's about the scars that don't heal, the memories that don't fade, and the struggle to find meaning in a life shaped by conflict. And if this truly is the final chapter, then it has the chance to do something rare, to end not with noise, but with impact. A quiet, powerful, unforgettable impact. As the conversation around Rambo 6 continues to evolve, one thing becomes increasingly clear. This isn't just a film that needs to entertain, it's a film that needs to conclude something meaningful. And that responsibility changes everything about how the story must be told. Because when a character like Rambo returns, especially after decades of history, the expectations are no longer about how many enemies he defeats, but about what his journey ultimately represents. One of the most powerful directions this film could take is embracing the idea that time is undefeated. For the first time in the franchise, the narrative could fully acknowledge that Rambo is no longer the unstoppable force he once was. Not in a way that weakens him, but in a way that humanizes him. Every movement, every decision, every moment of hesitation could carry weight. And instead of relying on pure physical dominance, the film could focus on experience, instinct, and the kind of intelligence that only comes from surviving countless battles. This shift would create a completely different kind of tension. Because now, the audience isn't just watching to see if Rambo wins. They're watching to see how much it costs him this time. And that emotional investment is far more powerful than any explosion or action sequence. It transforms the film from a spectacle into a journey. There's also a strong possibility that the film could explore the concept of silence in a very deliberate way. Not just literal silence, but emotional silence. The things Rambo never said, the pain he never expressed, the memories he never shared. Imagine scenes where dialogue is minimal, but the storytelling is driven through expressions, body language, and atmosphere. These moments could become some of the most impactful parts of the film, proving that sometimes what isn't said carries more weight than what is. This layered approach would make each moment feel more immersive and significant. Sound design could also play a crucial role in shaping the experience. Silence, in particular, could be used as a powerful tool. Imagine moments where all sound drops out, leaving only the character's breathing or heartbeat. This kind of detail would pull the audience deeper into the scene, making them feel every second of tension. As for the ending, this is where the film has the opportunity to truly define itself. There are several directions it could take, and each one carries its own emotional weight. One possibility is an ending that focuses on peace, not as a reward, but as a hard-earned state of acceptance. Another possibility is a more ambiguous conclusion, leaving the audience to interpret what Rambo's journey ultimately means. There's also the chance that the film could take a bold risk and deliver an ending that challenges expectations entirely. Instead of a traditional resolution, it could leave certain questions unanswered, reflecting the reality that not every story has a clear conclusion. This kind of ending would spark discussion, keeping the film relevant long after its release. The impact of Rambo 6, if executed correctly, could extend beyond the franchise itself. It could influence how action films approach storytelling, proving that even the most iconic characters can evolve and explore deeper themes. In an industry often driven by spectacle, This kind of film would stand out by offering substance alongside intensity. And then there's the audience, the fans who have followed this journey for decades. For them, this isn't just another movie. It's the continuation of a story they've grown up with, a character they've connected with, and a legacy they've watched unfold over time. Meeting those expectations is not an easy task, but it's also what makes this project so important. As the anticipation surrounding Rambo 6 continues to build, there's one final layer that could define the entire experience in a way no previous installment has fully explored. The idea that this story might not just be about Rambo's last mission, but about confronting the very identity that has followed him his entire life. Because when you strip away the weapons, the battles, and the enemies, what you're left with is a man who has spent decades trying to survive in a world that never really gave him a place to belong. And that's where this film could hit the hardest, not through action, but through truth. One of the most powerful possibilities is that Rambo 6 could present a version of the character who is no longer running toward conflict, but no longer running away from it either. Instead, he stands still. And that stillness becomes the most dangerous and emotional space of all. Because for the first time, he is forced to face everything without distraction. No mission, no orders, no clear enemy, just himself. This kind of narrative creates a different kind of tension, one that doesn't rely on external threats, but on internal pressure. The audience isn't just wondering what will happen next, they're wondering what Rambo is thinking, what he's feeling, and what he might do when he finally confronts the truth about his own past. There's also a strong chance that the film could blur the line between memory and reality in a subtle but effective way. Moments where the audience isn't entirely sure whether what they're seeing is happening in the present or is a reflection of something that already happened. This technique could create a haunting atmosphere, reinforcing the idea that for Rambo, the past is never truly gone. Imagine a scene where he walks through a quiet environment, no sound, no movement, and suddenly, echoes of past battles begin to overlap with the present. Not in a loud or dramatic way, but in fragments. Quick flashes, faint sounds, a visual reminder that even in silence, his world is never truly at peace. Another layer that could elevate the story is the idea of consequence reaching its final form. Not just consequences from recent events, but from everything. Every mission, every decision, every life taken or saved. This accumulation of experiences could reach a breaking point where Rambo is no longer able to carry it the same way he used to. And instead of portraying that as weakness, the film could present it as awareness. Because understanding the weight of your actions takes more strength than ignoring them. This shift in perspective could redefine the character in a way that feels both natural and powerful. It doesn't erase who he was, it explains who he has become. There's also a possibility that the film could include a moment where Rambo is given a choice that reflects his entire journey. Not a choice between good and evil, but a choice between continuing the cycle or ending it. And that moment could become the defining point of the entire story. If handled correctly, this decision wouldn't just impact the outcome of the plot, it would redefine the meaning of everything that came before. It would answer the question that has followed the character for years. Was it all worth it? From a cinematic standpoint, this is where everything, music, pacing, visuals, and performance, would need to come together perfectly. The tension would not come from fast movement, but from stillness. The kind of stillness that makes the audience lean forward, waiting, knowing that something important is about to happen. And when that moment finally arrives, it doesn't need to be explosive. In fact, it might be more powerful if it isn't. Because sometimes the most impactful decisions are the quiet ones. Another interesting possibility is that the film could subtly reconnect with the roots of the franchise. Not through direct references, but through tone and emotion. A reminder of where it all began and how far the character has come. This kind of full-circle storytelling could give the film a sense of completeness that resonates deeply with longtime fans. There's also room for a final symbolic image, something simple but meaningful. It could be a location, an object, or even a moment of stillness that represents everything the character has gone through. This image wouldn't need explanation. Its power would come from context, from everything the audience has experienced leading up to it. And then comes the ending. Not just the final scene, but the final feeling. Because what truly defines a film like this isn't how it ends. It's how it stays with the audience after it's over. The best possible outcome for Rambo 6 is not just that people watch it, but that they think about it afterward, that they replay certain moments in their mind, that they question what they saw, what it meant, and how it connects to the larger story. And this is where one of the smartest storytelling techniques could come into play, a loop-style ending. An ending that quietly connects back to the beginning. Not in an obvious way, but in a subtle, almost hidden way. Maybe the final scene mirrors the opening scene. Maybe the same environment, the same framing, but with a completely different meaning. At the start, it might feel like isolation. At the end, it might feel like acceptance. Or maybe it's the opposite. And that contrast creates a sense of closure that doesn't need to be explained. It's felt. This kind of ending is incredibly powerful for YouTube content as well, because it encourages viewers to rewatch, to catch details they might have missed, and to engage with the story on a deeper level. It turns a simple viewing into an experience. And that's exactly what a film like this needs. Because at its core, the story of Rambo has never just been about action. It's been about survival, about identity, about the cost of conflict, and most importantly, about what happens when the fighting finally stops. Because eventually, every warrior reaches a moment where there are no more battles left to fight. And in that moment, the only question that matters is, who are you without the war? If Rambo 6 can answer that question in a way that feels honest, emotional, and real, then it won't just be another sequel. It will be a conclusion that defines an entire legacy. A final chapter that doesn't just end the story, but gives it meaning. As the anticipation around Rambo 6 continues to grow, there is one final dimension that could elevate this project from a great film to something unforgettable, and that is the connection between the story and the audience itself. Because at this point, Rambo is no longer just a character on screen. He's a reflection of something much larger. For decades, audiences have watched him fight battles that seemed impossible, survive situations that defied logic, and endure pain that most characters would never recover from. But what makes this journey resonate isn't just the action. It's the idea that no matter how broken things get, he keeps going. And that simple concept is something viewers connect with on a deeply personal level. This is where Rambo 6 has a unique opportunity, not just to tell a story, but to mirror the emotional state of the audience watching it, because the world has changed, and so has the way people connect with films. Today, audiences are not just looking for spectacle, they're looking for meaning. They want stories that reflect real struggles, real emotions, and real consequences. And that's exactly where this film could stand out. Imagine watching a character who has spent his entire life fighting, finally reach a point where fighting is no longer the answer. That shift alone carries a powerful message. It challenges everything the audience expects, and in doing so, it creates a deeper level of engagement. This is where the film could become more than entertainment. It could become an experience. Another important layer is the psychological connection between Rambo and the viewer. Over time, the audience has grown with this character. Some watched him as a symbol of strength, others as a symbol of survival, and some as a representation of inner struggle. And now, seeing him at this stage of his journey creates a unique emotional impact. Because it's not just his story that's evolving. It's the audience's perspective as well. What once felt like pure action now feels like consequence. What once felt like victory now feels like cost. And that transformation is what gives this film its weight. There's also a strong possibility that the film could intentionally slow down certain moments, not just for storytelling, but to allow the audience to reflect. These pauses would create space. Space to think. Space to feel. Space to connect. And in a world where everything moves fast, that kind of storytelling stands out. It holds attention in a different way, not through constant stimulation, but through emotional gravity. From a deeper perspective, Rambo 6 could also explore the idea that strength is not always about winning. Sometimes, it's about choosing not to continue the same cycle. And that message, if delivered correctly, could resonate far beyond the film itself, because it applies to real life, to choices, to growth, to change. Another fascinating possibility is that the film could subtly acknowledge the audience without breaking immersion, not in a direct way, but through themes and moments that feel almost self-aware. As if the story understands its place in cinematic history and uses that awareness to enhance the experience. This kind of meta layer doesn't need to be obvious. In fact, it works best when it's subtle, when the audience feels it rather than being told. And when that happens, the connection becomes stronger. There's also the idea that this film could redefine what an ending actually means. Instead of presenting a clear final moment, it could present a transition, a shift from one phase to another, not just for the character, but for the audience as well. Because endings are not always about stopping. Sometimes they're about understanding. And that understanding is what stays with people long after the film is over. From a YouTube perspective, this kind of storytelling is extremely powerful. It increases watch time, encourages comments, and creates discussions. People don't just watch, they react, they analyze, they share their interpretations. And that's exactly what you want for your content. Because when viewers feel something, they engage. And when they engage, your video grows. Another important aspect is how the film could handle expectations. Instead of giving the audience exactly what they think they want, it could give them something they didn't realize they needed. And that surprise, when done right, can create a much stronger impact than predictable storytelling. This doesn't mean removing action or intensity. It means redefining them, making them serve the story instead of just existing for spectacle. And that's what separates a good film from a memorable one. As we move toward the final moments of this extended vision, there's one last idea that could tie everything together: the concept of meaning through reflection. Not just for Rambo, but for everyone watching. Because at the end of the day, the reason stories like this last for decades is not because of what happens on screen. It's because of how they make people feel, how they make people think, how they make people see things differently. And if Rambo 6 can achieve that, then it won't just be remembered as another installment. It will be remembered as a conclusion that mattered. A story that respected its past, understood its present, and delivered something meaningful for the future. And maybe that's the most important part of all. Because after everything, after all the battles, all the losses, all the years, what truly remains is not the fight, but the meaning behind it. And if this story can leave the audience with that feeling, then it has already succeeded. As the narrative possibilities around Rambo 6 continue to expand, there's one direction that could completely transform the tone of the story, and that is the idea that, for the first time, Rambo is no longer just a fighter. He is the target. And not just any target, but a legend that others are now trying to hunt. This shift alone changes everything about the dynamic of the film. Because in previous stories, Rambo has always been the one adapting, surviving, and outsmarting enemies who underestimated him. But what happens when the people coming after him already know who he is? What happens when they've studied him, learned from him, and possibly even trained because of him? This creates a completely new level of tension. Because now, Rambo isn't just facing enemies. He's facing evolution. There's a strong possibility that the film could introduce a group or organization that sees Rambo not as a man, but as a blueprint, a symbol of what a perfect soldier looks like. And instead of fearing that idea, they've tried to replicate it. Faster, younger, more controlled, and far less human. This concept opens the door for a psychological conflict that goes far beyond physical combat. Because Rambo would not just be fighting for survival. He would be confronting a version of himself that has been stripped of everything that made him human. No hesitation, no regret, no memory, just efficiency. And that's where the emotional weight becomes incredibly powerful. Because suddenly, the question is no longer, can Rambo win? It becomes, should someone like Rambo even exist again? This kind of narrative forces the audience to rethink everything they admired about the character. All the strength, all the survival instincts, all the brutality, it now has a darker reflection, a version without limits. And that reflection becomes the enemy. From a storytelling perspective, this also allows the film to build suspense in a much smarter way. Instead of loud, constant action, we get calculated tension. Scenes where Rambo is being tracked, observed, studied. Moments where he realizes he's not the one in control anymore. Imagine a sequence where Rambo sets a trap, something he's done countless times before, but this time, the trap doesn't work. Not because it failed, but because the enemy predicted it. That single moment would instantly show the audience that this is a different kind of threat. A threat that understands him. Maybe even better than he understands himself. Another powerful angle could be the idea that the people hunting him don't see themselves as villains. In their perspective, they're improving the world. creating a system where soldiers don't suffer, don't question, and don't break. And that belief makes them even more dangerous. Because they're not driven by revenge. They're driven by purpose. This creates a moral conflict where Rambo is not just fighting against people, but against an ideology. An idea that directly challenges his existence. And for a character who has always relied on instinct rather than philosophy, this becomes a deeply personal battle. Yet there's also room here for intense, strategic storytelling. Instead of large-scale destruction, the film could focus on smaller, more precise encounters, each one revealing a little more about the enemy and a little more about Rambo's limitations, because for the first time, he might not be the smartest person in the room. And that vulnerability adds a whole new layer to the character. It doesn't make him weaker. It makes him real. Another interesting possibility is that the film could show how Rambo reacts to being hunted. Does he go back to his old ways? Does he adapt? Or does he try to avoid the conflict altogether? And that hesitation could become a key part of the story, because hesitation, in a world like this, can be dangerous, but it can also be human. From a visual standpoint, this direction could create some incredible scenes. Dark environments, minimal lighting, long tracking shots where the audience feels like they're watching Rambo from a distance, just like the enemy is. This kind of cinematography would not only build tension, but also reinforce the idea that Rambo is no longer invisible. He is being watched, constantly, and that changes the entire atmosphere of the film. There's also a strong emotional layer here, because being hunted is not just physical, it's psychological. Knowing that someone is always one step behind you, always analyzing, always waiting. That pressure builds over time, and eventually, something has to break. But what makes this direction truly powerful is how it connects back to the core theme of the entire story. Legacy. Because in a way, this situation is Rambo's legacy. The skills he mastered, the methods he used, the way he survived. All of it has been observed, copied, and turned into something new, something more dangerous. And now he has to face it, not as a hero, but as the origin. And that realization could lead to one of the most powerful moments in the film. A moment where Rambo understands that the world didn't just move on from him. It evolved because of him. And that truth carries weight, because it means everything he did mattered, but not necessarily in the way he expected. As the tension builds toward the next phase of the story, this concept sets up something even bigger. Because if Rambo is being hunted, then eventually, he will stop running. And when that happens, the hunter becomes the hunted again. But this time, the fight won't just be about survival. It will be about proving that being human, with flaws, pain, and hesitation, is still stronger than being perfect. As the story possibilities around Rambo 6 continue to evolve, there is one direction that could push this film into a completely different league. Something deeper, darker, and far more intense than anything we've seen before. Not just a physical battle, but a psychological war. Because what if, this time, the enemy isn't just chasing Rambo from the outside, but breaking him from the inside? There's a powerful possibility that the film could introduce a form of psychological warfare designed specifically for someone like Rambo. Not weapons, not armies, but something far more dangerous: control over perception. Imagine an enemy that doesn't just track his movements, but understands his mind, his trauma, his memories, his weaknesses, and instead of attacking him directly, they use all of that against him. This could create a situation where Rambo is forced into environments that feel real, but aren't entirely what they seem. Places that trigger memories, sounds that don't belong, faces from the past appearing at the worst possible moments. And slowly, the line between reality and memory starts to blur. This is where the film could become something completely different from a traditional action story. Because now, the audience isn't just watching Rambo fight enemies. They're experiencing his confusion, his doubt, and his struggle to stay grounded. And that creates a level of tension that pure action can't achieve. Imagine a scene where Rambo enters a quiet location, scanning for danger, every instinct telling him something is wrong. But there's nothing there. No movement, no sound, until suddenly, he sees someone he hasn't seen in years. A face from his past, a moment frozen in time. And for a split second, he reacts, not as a soldier, but as a man. That hesitation could be all it takes. This kind of storytelling allows the film to explore trauma in a very raw and immersive way. Not through dialogue, but through experience. The audience doesn't just hear about his past, they feel how it affects him in real time. Another powerful layer could be the idea that the enemy isn't creating these illusions randomly. They're strategic, targeted, designed to break him piece by piece. Each memory triggered at the exact moment it will hurt the most. Each illusion crafted to force a reaction. And over time, those reactions become unpredictable, because even Rambo starts to question what's real. This opens the door for incredibly intense sequences where the audience is just as unsure as the character. Scenes where tension builds not from what is happening, but from what might be happening. And that uncertainty becomes the real threat. There's also a deeper emotional angle here. Because facing your past is one thing, but being forced to relive it repeatedly without control, that's something else entirely. And for someone like Rambo, whose life has been defined by those experiences, this becomes a battle that can't be won with strength alone. It requires something different: clarity, acceptance, control over his own mind. And that's not something he's ever had to rely on before. This shift could lead to a powerful transformation in the character. Instead of reacting purely on instinct, he begins to slow down, to observe, to question, to think. Because in a world where nothing is certain, thinking becomes survival. Another interesting possibility is that the film could use these psychological elements to reveal new aspects of Rambo's past. Not in a direct, explanatory way, but through fragmented moments that hint at deeper stories. Things we've never seen, decisions we didn't know about, regrets that were never spoken. This adds depth not just to the current story, but to the entire character arc across the franchise. It makes everything feel more connected, more complete. From a cinematic perspective, this direction allows for creative visuals that go beyond traditional action scenes. Distorted environments, sudden transitions, moments where the camera itself feels unstable. All of it designed to pull the audience into Rambo's perspective, to make them feel what he feels: confusion, pressure, disorientation, and eventually, clarity. Because at some point, Rambo has to break through it. He has to find a way to separate reality from illusion. And that moment, when it happens, could be one of the most powerful in the entire film. Not because of what he does, but because of what he understands. That the past doesn't control him anymore. That the memories, no matter how painful, are just that, memories. And once he reaches that point, everything changes. Because now, the psychological warfare loses its power, and the enemy loses its advantage. But by then, the damage has already been done. The question is no longer whether Rambo can fight back. It's whether he can recover fast enough to survive what comes next. Because while he was fighting his past, the real threat was still moving forward, still closing in, still preparing for something bigger. And that realization sets up the next phase of the story, a phase where the psychological battle is over. But the physical war is just beginning. And this time, Rambo is not just fighting to survive. He's fighting to prove that even after everything, after the pain, the memories, the manipulation, he is still in control. As the layers of Rambo 6 continue to unfold, the story begins to shift in a way that changes everything the audience thought they understood. Up until this point, the conflict has felt external. Enemies hunting, psychological warfare, survival against impossible odds. But what if the real threat was never just the enemy? What if it was the system that created Rambo in the first place? This is where the story could take a bold and powerful turn, introducing the idea that the very institutions Rambo once served no longer see him as an asset. They see him as a problem, a liability, a living reminder of a past they want to erase. There's a strong possibility that the film could reveal that the organization behind the advanced enemies, the ones hunting and studying Rambo, is not entirely separate from the government. In fact, it may be connected, funded, protected, and that revelation hits harder than any physical attack ever could. Because for Rambo, this isn't just betrayal. It's confirmation. Confirmation that everything he gave, everything he sacrificed, everything he survived, was never truly valued, only used. This kind of twist instantly raises the stakes to a completely different level. Now, the conflict is no longer just personal, it becomes systemic. A battle not just against individuals, but against a structure designed to control, replace, and eliminate anything it can't manage. And Rambo cannot be controlled. This is where the narrative becomes incredibly intense. Because now, Rambo is not just being hunted by trained operatives or manipulated through psychological tactics. He is being targeted by something much larger. Something organized. Something powerful. Something that knows exactly how he operates, because it helped create him. Imagine the moment when Rambo realizes the truth. Not through a long explanation, but through pieces coming together. A symbol, a communication signal. A familiar protocol. Something that connects the enemy back to the system he once trusted. And in that moment, everything changes. Because now, this isn't about survival anymore. It's about truth. There's also a powerful emotional weight to this revelation. Because betrayal doesn't just create anger, it creates clarity. A clarity that strips away illusion and forces the character to see the world as it really is. For Rambo, that clarity could be devastating, but it could also be freeing. Because once you understand the system is against you, you stop playing by its rules. This sets up a completely new version of Rambo. Not reactive, not defensive, but strategic, focused, deliberate. And for the first time in the story, the balance of control begins to shift. Another interesting angle here is the possibility that not everyone within the system agrees with what's happening. There could be individuals, insiders, who see the danger of what's being created. People who understand that replacing humanity with controlled efficiency is not progress. It's a mistake. These characters could create a layer of tension within the system itself, adding complexity to the narrative. Because now, it's not just Rambo versus the government. It's a fractured system, with conflicting motives and hidden agendas. And that makes the story feel more real, more grounded, more unpredictable. From a storytelling perspective, this is where the pacing could accelerate. The slow psychological tension from earlier parts now transforms into urgency. Information needs to be uncovered. Decisions need to be made quickly, and every move carries risk. Because once Rambo knows the truth, they know he knows, and that makes him even more dangerous. There's also the possibility that the system underestimates one thing, something they failed to calculate. Rambo is not just a soldier. He's a survivor who has spent his entire life adapting. And unlike their controlled operatives, he doesn't follow patterns. He breaks them. This creates an advantage that no amount of training or programming can replicate. Unpredictability. And in a world built on control, unpredictability is a threat. This shift could lead to some of the most intense sequences in the film. Not just action, but strategy. Moments where Rambo turns the system against itself, uses its own methods, exploits its weaknesses. Because the best way to fight something that created you is to understand it better than it understands itself. There's also a deeper theme emerging here. The idea that systems often outgrow the people who built them. What started as protection becomes control. What started as necessity becomes excess. And eventually, it turns on its own creators. This theme adds a level of realism that resonates with modern audiences. It reflects concerns about power, technology, and the cost of removing humanity from decision-making. And placing Rambo in the center of that conflict gives the story weight. Because he represents the opposite of that system. Imperfect, emotional, human. And that contrast becomes the core of the film. As the story builds toward its next phase, one thing becomes clear. This is no longer a fight that can be avoided. No longer a situation that can be escaped. This is a confrontation that has been building for years. And now, it's unavoidable. Because when the system that created you decides you shouldn't exist anymore, you have two choices: disappear or fight back. And knowing Rambo, there's only one direction this story is heading. What was once a controlled operation turns into a full mobilization. Elite units, advanced tracking systems, and coordinated global efforts all focused on one objective: eliminate the threat before it spreads. But the problem is, the threat is already inside the system. And that creates paranoia. Because when every shadow could be Rambo, every decision becomes uncertain. This psychological pressure begins to affect not just the field operatives, but the leadership itself. Orders become conflicting. Information becomes unreliable. Trust begins to collapse from within. And that collapse is exactly what Rambo exploits. There's a powerful narrative possibility here where he begins using the system's own structure against itself, feeding false signals, redirecting forces, creating scenarios where the enemy unknowingly weakens its own position while trying to strengthen it. And the more they try to control the situation, the more they lose control. This is where the film could introduce some of its most intense sequences, not just action-heavy moments, but strategic confrontations where intelligence matters more than firepower. Because Rambo is no longer just reacting in real time. He is thinking several steps ahead. There's also a deeper emotional layer emerging in this phase of the story. Because while the system sees him as a threat to be eliminated, Rambo sees something else, that a cycle that must end. Not for revenge, but for resolution. This distinction becomes crucial, because it separates destruction from purpose. And Rambo has never been driven by chaos alone. He has always been driven by meaning, even in the darkest circumstances. As the conflict escalates further, the scale of the situation begins to expand. What started as a personal pursuit transforms into something far larger. The system realizes that containing Rambo is no longer possible using standard methods. Every attempt to isolate him only pushes him further into adaptation. And adaptation is where he thrives. At this point, the story reaches a critical threshold, the realization that the only way to stop Rambo is to confront him directly. No more proxies. No more shadows. No more hidden operations. A direct confrontation becomes inevitable, and that sets the stage for something massive. An organized, high-level response designed not just to eliminate him, but to understand him. Because even his enemies begin to realize something uncomfortable. He is not operating like a typical target. He is operating like a force of nature shaped by experience, loss, and survival instincts that cannot be replicated or predicted. And that makes him unpredictable in the most dangerous way possible. From a cinematic perspective, this phase of the story could deliver some of the most intense sequences in the entire film. Not just in terms of action, but in tension, pacing, and stakes. Every moment feels like a setup for something larger. Every silence feels like pressure building. And underneath it all, the sense that everything is converging toward a final confrontation. Because once both sides fully commit, there is no turning back. And Rambo understands that better than anyone. He doesn't fight for escalation. He fights for resolution. And now, resolution is no longer optional. It is coming, one way or another. With the conflict escalating after the revelations surrounding Rambo 6, the situation has now reached a point where containment is no longer possible. What began as a hidden operation has expanded into a coordinated global response, because the system has finally accepted a difficult truth. Rambo is no longer a local threat. He is a worldwide problem. And that changes everything. At this stage, the narrative shifts into something far larger than anything seen before in the franchise. Borders no longer matter. Safe zones no longer exist. Every known location, every potential hideout, every possible escape route is now. It's the entire structure trying to contain him, and failing. At the same time, there is a growing awareness inside the command structure that something deeper is happening. Rambo is not just eliminating threats or avoiding capture. He is actively shaping outcomes. Every encounter seems to lead to a larger consequence. Every engagement affects the next. It becomes clear that this is no longer a chase. It is a calculated dismantling. And that realization shifts the tone completely. Because now the system is not just trying to capture Rambo. It is trying to stop a collapse. But the collapse is already in motion. There's also a powerful emotional undertone developing in this phase. As the scale increases, the story subtly reminds the audience of something important. The more powerful the system becomes, the more impersonal it becomes. Decisions are made from distance. Actions are executed without visibility. Consequences are measured in data, not human cost. And Rambo stands as the opposite of that. Personal, direct, human. That contrast becomes one of the strongest thematic elements of the entire story. As the global hunt intensifies, Rambo begins to draw the enemy into specific regions, locations that force them to spread thin, overextend, and divide their resources. What looks like escape is actually orchestration. What looks like survival is actually strategy. And the system begins to realize something unsettling. They are not directing the operation anymore. They are responding to it. And that shift in control is dangerous. Because once a system built on authority starts reacting instead of leading, it begins to fail. At this point, the elite units are forced into direct encounters more frequently. But each encounter feels incomplete, not decisive. Almost like Rambo is testing them rather than fighting them fully, studying their behavior, measuring their response time, learning how they adapt under pressure. Every signal he disrupted, it all connects, not as escape routes, but as preparation. And that realization changes the entire tone of the operation. Because if Rambo is not running away, then he is moving towards something. And that something becomes the central focus of the entire global response. The elite units deployed earlier are now operating at maximum capacity, but something has shifted. The confidence that once defined them is gone. In its place is caution, because every previous assumption about Rambo has been challenged. They expected reaction. They got design. They expected survival. They got control. And now they are forced to accept the possibility that they are not hunting him anymore. They are being led. Meanwhile, Rambo's movements become even more deliberate. He no longer hides in the traditional sense. Instead, he positions himself in ways that force engagement. Not to be found, but to shape where the confrontation will happen. And slowly, the location begins to reveal itself. It is not a city, not a military base, not a controlled environment. It is something symbolic. A place that carries weight beyond strategy. A place tied to history, conflict, memory, and finality. Inside command centers, tension rises as satellite data, field reports, and intercepted communications all begin pointing toward the same conclusion. The final convergence point is being locked in. And once it is locked, there is no stopping it. Because at that point, Rambo will no longer be evading pursuit. He will be waiting. This is where the story transitions from global chase to final preparation. Units are repositioned. Strategies are rewritten. Command structures are simplified into one objective: arrive before he fully establishes control of the location. But the problem is time. Rambo is already there first, or close enough to shape what happens next. And that creates a sense of inevitability. Because no matter how advanced the system is, it is still reacting. And reacting is always one step behind. There is also a deeper emotional weight building underneath all of this. Because at this stage, Rambo is no longer just a tactical target. He is a symbol of everything the system cannot fully understand or predict. He represents unpredictability in its purest form, experience without structure, instinct without limitation, survival without compromise. And that combination cannot be fully controlled. As the elite forces approach the convergence zone, tension reaches a breaking point. Communication becomes tighter. Movement becomes slower. Every step forward feels heavier, as if the environment itself is warning them that what they are walking into cannot be reversed. And then comes the realization. This is not a capture operation anymore. It is a confrontation setup, a final alignment of forces. Everything is now positioned for impact. And for the first time, both sides are fully aware of it. Rambo is no longer hiding. The system is no longer hunting blindly. Both are moving toward the same point, but for different reasons. One seeks resolution. The other seeks control. And when those two forces finally meet, something has to break. Because this is no longer about tactics, no longer about survival, no longer about pursuit. This is about the end of a cycle that has been building for years. A cycle of conflict, of reaction, of escalation. And now it is about to close. The final preparations are no longer strategic. They are inevitable. Every decision now carries final weight. Every movement leads closer to impact. And at the center of it all, Rambo waits, not as a fugitive, not as a soldier, but as the origin of everything that is about to end. And the system finally understands. This was never just a hunt. It was a countdown. And the countdown has reached its final moments. With every force converging on the final location tied to Rambo 6, the atmosphere shifts in a way that is no longer about preparation or prediction. Everything has reached its limit. The system is fully deployed. The elite units are in position. Surveillance is locked. Communication lines are stabilized. And yet, despite all of that control, there is one thing they still cannot fully account for. Rambo is already inside the equation, not as an outsider approaching the battlefield, but as someone who has already shaped it before the first shot is even fired. The moment of first contact doesn't arrive with noise or chaos. It arrives with silence. The kind of silence that feels unnatural in a fully mobilized operation. No early warning signs. No clear signal. just a sudden realization among the forward units that something has changed. Positions that were secure are no longer secure. Sightlines that were clear are now uncertain. And movement that was coordinated begins to fragment. Because Rambo doesn't reveal himself immediately. He lets the system feel his presence first. And that feeling alone is enough to disrupt structure. Inside the elite formation, tension spikes as the first reports come in. Unconfirmed sightings, disrupted communication channels, and missing visual confirmation from key sectors. At first, they assume it is interference, environmental distortion, technical failure, but then it becomes consistent, patterned, intentional, and that's when the truth begins to settle in. This is not random disruption. This is positioning. Rambo is not attacking yet. He is isolating, separating units, breaking coordination before engagement even begins. And the first contact happens not as a dramatic explosion of violence, but as a disappearance. One unit goes silent, then another. No warning, no recovery window, just absence. And that absence spreads fear faster than any visible threat ever could. As the elite forces tighten formation, they attempt to regain control of the situation. Defensive protocols are activated. Perimeter scans are increased. Tactical adjustments are made in real time. But everything feels slightly behind, slightly delayed, like they are always reacting to something that has already happened. And that's when the first direct encounter finally occurs. Not a full battle, not a large-scale engagement, just a brief moment of contact in a fractured environment. A single visual confirmation, a silhouette, a movement that appears and disappears before it can be fully processed. And in that moment, everything changes. Because now they know he is not just nearby. He is actively inside the structure of their operation. The elite unit closest to the encounter attempts immediate pursuit, but the environment itself becomes unpredictable. Routes that were mapped no longer align. Paths that were clear become obstructed. Movement becomes inefficient, almost as if the space itself has been reorganized. And that's when the realization deepens. Rambo is not simply reacting to them. He is guiding them into positions he has already decided. From this point forward, engagement becomes unavoidable. The first controlled exchange begins, not a full-scale firefight, but a sharp, precise clash of presence and reaction. Short bursts of contact, immediate withdrawal, repositioning, silence again. Each encounter lasts seconds, but each one changes the structure of the battlefield. Because every time the elite forces attempt to stabilize, they lose more cohesion. And every time Rambo appears, he leaves them with less certainty than before. This is where the psychological weight of the confrontation becomes just as important as the physical threat. Because the system is no longer fighting a visible enemy. They are fighting a shifting pattern of control that cannot be fully predicted or contained. And that creates fear, not panic. Fear that builds slowly, quietly, systemically. At the same time, Rambo is no longer just observing. He is executing the first phase of full engagement strategy, not to eliminate immediately, but to dismantle the structure piece by piece. Because he understands something the system does not fully accept yet. A strong enemy can still be beaten, but a controlled system can be broken. And that is what he is doing. As the first contact phase continues, the battlefield becomes increasingly fragmented. Units are no longer operating as a single force. Communication is delayed. Response coordination weakens. And the elite formation that once represented precision begins to feel scattered. And in the center of that collapse, Rambo remains unseen most of the time, but always present. And that presence alone is enough to dictate the rhythm of the conflict. Because now, the system is no longer entering a confrontation on its terms. It is entering on his. And that realization marks the true beginning of the final war. Not when the first shot was fired, but when control was lost. After the fractured first contact around Rambo 6, the situation can no longer be contained within controlled engagement parameters. What began as a structured operation has now completely transitioned into active warfare. The elite units that once operated with precision are no longer functioning as a unified force. Coordination is breaking down faster than it can be restored. Communication channels are overloaded with incomplete reports, conflicting sightings, and delayed confirmations. And at the center of it all, Rambo is no longer hiding. He is responding, but in a way that feels fundamentally different from anything the system prepared for. Because this is no longer evasion. It is execution of control removal. The battlefield begins to transform almost immediately after escalation. Zones that were once considered secure become unpredictable. Movement corridors are no longer reliable. Even established positions lose their strategic advantage within minutes. And every time the system attempts to stabilize, it becomes clear that stability is no longer possible. Rambo's presence is no longer tied to a single location. Instead, it feels distributed, almost like he is not fighting the battlefield, but reshaping it. Every engagement now follows a similar pattern. Brief contact, rapid shift, immediate imbalance. The elite forces attempt to respond with structured formations, but those formations begin to collapse under the pressure of constant disruption. And that's when the realization fully sets in. This is not a defensive operation anymore. It is a dismantling phase. Inside command structures, urgency escalates. The objective shifts from containment to survival of operational integrity. But the problem is already systemic. Every decision made in real time is already one step behind the unfolding situation. Because Rambo is no longer reacting to moves. He is anticipating systems and exploiting them before they fully activate. As the conflict intensifies, the environment itself becomes part of the strategy. Terrain that was once neutral now plays an active role in engagement. Visibility shifts. Movement becomes restricted in unpredictable ways. What should be tactical advantage zones become points of vulnerability. And every time elite units try to regroup, they are forced to split again. Because cohesion is now their greatest weakness. And fragmentation is exactly what Rambo is creating. There are moments during this phase where direct confrontation finally escalates beyond brief encounters. Full exchanges begin to occur, but they are still not traditional battles. They are controlled disruptions. Fast, focused, unstable. Each side adapts mid-conflict, but only one side maintains continuity between engagements. And that is the deciding factor. Rambo is not fighting isolated moments. He is fighting a continuous system. And the system is struggling to maintain its own identity under pressure. This is where the psychological collapse begins to deepen. Because elite forces are trained for confrontation, but not for uncertainty that evolves faster than their response cycle. Every failed prediction reduces confidence. Every missed engagement increases hesitation. And hesitation spreads. Because in structured systems, doubt is contagious. Meanwhile, Rambo's approach becomes increasingly clear. He is not attempting to overpower the entire force in one moment. Instead, he is systematically breaking their ability to function as a coordinated entity. He isolates communication nodes, disrupts movement synchronization, forces reactive behavior instead of planned execution. And slowly, the system begins to degrade from within. And as the final layers of structure begin to fail, one realization becomes unavoidable across all levels of command. This is no longer a battle being fought. It is a collapse already in motion, and they are inside it. After the total breakdown of coordinated structure during the ongoing conflict tied to Rambo 6, what remains is no longer a standard military operation. It is a collapsing system attempting to stabilize itself in real time while already losing control of the battlefield. The elite forces that were once deployed as the final layer of containment are now fragmented. Communication is inconsistent. Movement is reactive. And the command structure that once dictated every phase of engagement is now forced into survival-based decision-making. And at this stage, the system makes its final strategic decision. A full consolidation of remaining elite units. Not for expansion, not for control, but for one purpose only. To end the conflict in a single decisive confrontation. This is where the story shifts into its most dangerous phase yet. Because when a system realizes it cannot maintain control through strategy, it resorts to concentration of force. Every remaining operational unit is redirected toward a single convergence point. The battlefield is no longer wide or fragmented. It is collapsing inward, compressing into a focused zone where the final engagement will occur. And that is exactly what Rambo anticipated, because while the system is concentrating its power, he is already inside the structure of that decision, not waiting for it, shaping it. As the final elite formation begins to assemble, tension reaches a level that is no longer tactical. It is existential. These are not regular field units. They are the most controlled, most disciplined, most heavily coordinated forces remaining, designed specifically for one outcome: direct elimination. But the problem is no longer capability. It is predictability. Because every movement they make is now being measured against a system that no longer operates normally. And Rambo is operating outside that system entirely. As the final formation begins to take shape, the environment around them becomes increasingly unstable. Not because of external interference, but because of internal imbalance. Every unit is aware that this is the final engagement, and that awareness changes behavior in subtle but critical ways. Movement becomes more cautious. Communication becomes more compressed. Reaction time increases slightly, and those small shifts create openings, which Rambo immediately identifies. At this point, the battlefield is no longer about territory. It is about positioning for a final exchange. Every side is attempting to define the moment of impact on their own terms. But only one side has been controlling timing from the beginning. And that is the difference. As the elite formation reaches full deployment, they attempt to lock down the convergence zone. Perimeter control is established. Surveillance systems are fully activated. Defensive layers are stacked in depth. On paper, it is perfect. In reality, it is already compromised, because control assumes predictability, and predictability no longer exists. The first cracks appear in communication flow, then in movement synchronization, then in spatial awareness between units. Not through direct assault, but through continuous disruption that has already been seeded throughout the system, and now it is activating all at once. The elite formation begins to realize that their structure is not being attacked directly. Instead, it is being activated against itself. Every protocol they initiate is feeding into a larger pattern they cannot fully see. And at the center of that pattern, Rambo is present, not everywhere, but exactly where he needs to be. As engagement becomes unavoidable, the tone of the battlefield shifts completely. This is no longer fragmented contact. It is structured confrontation. Units begin to lock into final positions. Weapon systems are stabilized. Engagement rules are discarded. Because at this point, rules no longer matter. Only outcome does. And the system commits fully. This is the moment where everything converges into a single intent: eliminate the target at any cost. But Rambo's presence changes the meaning of that intent. Because elimination assumes containment. And containment has already failed. The first phase of direct final engagement begins almost immediately after full deployment. Not as chaos, but as controlled impact. Every exchange is deliberate. Every movement is calculated. But there is no longer symmetry between sides. One side is executing a plan. The other is dismantling it in real time. And that imbalance becomes visible very quickly. Despite overwhelming numbers and coordination, the elite formation begins to lose structural integrity almost immediately. Not through brute force alone, but through disruption of timing, communication, and cohesion. And once timing is broken, everything else follows. As pressure increases, command realizes something critical. This is not a final stand against a target. This is the final phase of a system collapse already in motion. And that realization comes too late to reverse it, because by the time full deployment is complete, the system is already inside the outcome. And Rambo is no longer responding to the battlefield. He is finalizing it as the system reaches its final operational threshold in the unfolding events of Rambo 6. What was once a fragmented global pursuit has now condensed into a single objective-driven reality. The elite formation is fully deployed. The battlefield is locked. The convergence point is stabilized. And yet, control still does not exist. Because even at maximum strength, the system is no longer acting as the dominant force. It is reacting to a structure that has already been shaped by something it cannot fully understand. Rambo is not just present within the battlefield anymore. He is defining its behavior. At this stage, command authority shifts into its final form. Communication channels are simplified into direct command loops. Field autonomy is removed. Every remaining unit is synchronized under a single directive: locate, engage, end. But the simplicity of that directive hides a deeper problem. The system assumes that once coordination is centralized, control will return. Instead, what happens is the opposite. Because centralization removes flexibility. And flexibility is exactly what is being exploited. As the final elite commander takes operational control on the ground, the situation becomes intensely focused. This is no longer a wide-scale operation. It is a concentrated engagement environment. Every unit is positioned with precision. Every route is accounted for. Every possible movement path is monitored. On paper, there is no escape. But Rambo has never operated within paper logic. The first true direct confrontation begins when elite units finally converge on what they believe to be his position. Unlike previous encounters, there is no hesitation in their approach. This is the final phase. Engagement is immediate, structured, and absolute. But what they find is not resolution. It is anticipation, because Rambo is already aware of their arrival before they fully commit. And that awareness changes everything. The environment itself feels different now. Not chaotic, but controlled in a way that does not belong to either side. Movements are minimal. Sound is reduced. Visibility feels intentionally limited, not by nature, but by positioning. It is as if the battlefield has already been arranged for this moment. And in many ways it has. As the elite formation advances, tension reaches its highest point yet. This is the moment where both sides fully understand what is about to happen, even if neither can stop it. Every step forward carries irreversible weight. And then, contact begins. Not as a full explosion of force, but as precise disruption. One unit loses synchronization, then another. Then communication delay begins to spread across the formation like a ripple. And suddenly, structure begins to fail in real time. The commander attempts to stabilize the formation, issuing direct orders to re-establish control. But every corrective action seems to arrive too late. Not because it is ineffective, but because it is always responding to something that has already changed. And that gap, that delay, becomes fatal. Rambo does not appear in full force. Instead, he appears in fragments. Short, decisive engagements that prevent any stable counter-response from forming. Every encounter resets momentum. Every engagement breaks rhythm. And rhythm is what the system depends on. Without it, there is no coordination, only reaction. As the battlefield deteriorates, the commander finally realizes the core truth of the situation. This is not a confrontation happening in real time. It is a sequence already decided. Every attempt to regain initiative only confirms that initiative no longer belongs to them. And that realization begins to fracture decision-making at the highest level. Because once leadership understands that control is gone, the system itself begins to hesitate. And hesitation spreads faster than orders. Meanwhile, Rambo continues executing the final phase of engagement, not as chaotic destruction, but as structured dismantling. Each movement serves a purpose. Each encounter reduces the system's ability to respond coherently. And slowly, the elite formation begins to collapse from within. Not physically at first, but operationally. Communication breaks, timing fails, coordination dissolves. And what remains is not a fighting force, but isolated units reacting independently. At this point, the commander attempts one final adjustment, full direct engagement. No coordination layers, no distributed structure, just a concentrated push toward resolution. But it is too late, because by the time that decision is made, the structure that supports it no longer exists in functional form. And Rambo is already positioned for the final phase. Not reacting, not waiting, but concluding. The battlefield is now fully defined. The system has reached its limit. And what happens next is no longer about strategy. It is about inevitability. Because when control collapses completely, only outcome remains. And the outcome has already been set in motion. The final structure of the operation begins to fail during the escalating events surrounding Rambo 6. What remains of the elite command system is forced into direct visibility. There are no more layers of coordination, no more buffer zones of control, and no more fragmented execution paths. Everything has narrowed into one final presence, the commander and the target. But even that framing is no longer accurate. Because at this stage, it is no longer a question of who is chasing whom. It is a question of who still has control over meaning. The battlefield has settled into a tense stillness that feels unnatural after everything that has happened. The chaos is gone, replaced by a structured silence that carries more weight than any explosion or engagement. Units have been reduced to scattered positions. Communication is minimal. Movement is cautious, almost restrained. And at the center of it all, the commander finally comes face to face with the reality of the situation. Not through reports, not through analysis, but through direct observation. Rambo is no longer hidden. But he is also not presenting himself in a traditional sense. There is no aggression in his posture, no urgency in his movement. Not because of hatred, but because of fundamental design. One exists to maintain systems. The other exists because systems failed. And that contradiction cannot be resolved through logic alone. The tension in this moment is not driven by action, but by inevitability. Both sides understand that this is the final exchange before resolution. Not necessarily physical resolution, but structural resolution. Something has to conclude, and neither side can walk away unchanged. The commander makes one final attempt to assert authority, not through force, but through framing. An appeal to structure, to order, to the idea that stability requires sacrifice. But Rambo does not respond as expected, because for him, sacrifice has already defined everything. What remains is not persuasion. It is acceptance, and that acceptance shifts the tone one final time. Because at this stage, the conflict is no longer about winning or losing. It is about whether continuation is even possible in its current form. And both sides already know the answer. The system cannot continue unchanged, and Rambo cannot return to what came before. So what remains is the final threshold moment. Not a battle yet, not resolution yet, but the point where everything converges into its final shape. And once that shape is formed, nothing can remain the same. After the final confrontation set up within the collapsing operational structure surrounding Rambo 6, the situation transitions beyond strategy, beyond dialogue, and beyond control. The moment between Rambo and the commander has already defined the emotional and philosophical end of the conflict. What remains now is the physical conclusion of everything that has been set in motion. The battlefield, once fragmented and unstable, now enters a strange form of clarity. Not peace, but focus. Every remaining unit, every surviving element of the elite formation, and every communication line is now locked into a single unavoidable reality. The final engagement has begun. There are no more adjustments, no more recalculations, no more repositioning, only execution. The first wave of full-scale confrontation erupts not as chaos, but as structured force meeting structured resistance. The elite formation, despite all losses and fragmentation, commits fully to its final directive. Every remaining resource is deployed. Every surviving coordination channel is activated. And for a brief moment, it looks like control might be restored. But that moment is immediately challenged, because Rambo is no longer operating within reaction cycles. He is fully inside execution mode now. Every movement he makes carries finality. Every engagement is decisive. There is no longer hesitation, no observation, no testing of patterns. Only conclusion. The battlefield becomes a layered sequence of collapsing engagements. One position falls, another stabilizes briefly, then collapses again. The system attempts to respond, but every response arrives into an environment that has already shifted. And that shift is permanent. What makes this phase different from everything before is the absence of uncertainty. Earlier stages were defined by confusion, adaptation, and psychological pressure. But now, everything is exposed. There is no hidden structure left, no unseen layer of control, only direct conflict. And that directness accelerates the breakdown. The elite formation begins to fragment at a structural level. Units that were once synchronized now operate independently, not by choice, but by necessity. Communication delay becomes irrelevance. Coordination becomes impossible to maintain at scale. And in that breakdown, Rambo begins to move with full clarity, not faster, not louder, but more decisive. Each engagement now feels like a closing statement rather than a battle. There is no extended exchange, no prolonged confrontation. Every encounter resolves almost immediately, either through displacement or disengagement. And with each resolution, the system loses coherence. Inside command awareness, the realization becomes unavoidable. The structure is no longer capable of sustaining itself, not because of external overwhelming force, but because internal synchronization has fully collapsed. And at the center of that collapse, Rambo continues advancing, not chasing victory, but finalizing outcome. At this point, the battlefield itself begins to feel different. The environment is no longer just terrain, it becomes memory in motion. Every location reflects previous engagements. Every corridor carries the weight of what has already occurred. And as the final phases unfold, the distinction between pursuit and resolution disappears entirely. Everything converges into one direction. The remaining elite units attempt one final coordinated resistance, a last structured push designed to re-establish control long enough to force a decisive outcome. But coordination is no longer functional in the way it was designed. The attempt happens too late, because the system is already past the point of recovery. And as the final push begins, Rambo responds not as a survivor, but as the final variable completing the equation. The confrontation intensifies rapidly, but there is no longer symmetry. One side is executing a collapsing structure. The other is acting within the collapse itself. And that difference defines everything. Because in systems like this, timing is everything. And timing has already been lost. As the final engagements unfold, it becomes clear that the outcome is no longer uncertain. The system is not being defeated in a single moment. It is dissolving in sequence, layer by layer, function by function, until nothing remains but the final convergence point, and that point is already active. The last stage of the operation is no longer about resistance or control. It is about completion, and as everything reaches its final alignment, the war does not end with a single strike. It ends with structure itself collapsing under the weight of its own attempt to contain something that could not be contained. And at the center of that collapse, Rambo remains, not as part of the system, but as the force that revealed its limits. After the final collapse of the operational structure surrounding Rambo 6, the battlefield no longer resembles a conflict zone. What remains is not chaos, not active resistance, and not even structured failure. What remains is silence. A silence so complete that it feels unnatural after everything that has occurred. The system that once operated with global coordination, elite formations, and layered command structures has now fully dissolved. Not in a single moment of destruction, but through a gradual, irreversible breakdown of every component that once gave it function. Units that were once synchronized are now disconnected. Communication channels are inactive. Command presence is no longer operational. And the battlefield itself no longer responds to any system-based logic. It simply exists. Empty, still, and final. In the center of this stillness, Rambo stands not as a fighter in motion, but as the last remaining point of continuity in a collapsing framework. There is no pursuit anymore, no resistance, no coordinated threat, only the aftermath of everything that has already concluded. And in this space, something unexpected happens. The absence of conflict begins to reveal its emotional weight. Because for someone who has lived through constant survival, constant movement, and constant pressure, silence is not comfort. It is unfamiliar. The environment no longer demands reaction, no longer requires adaptation, no longer forces decisions at every moment. And that creates a different kind of tension, not external, but internal. This is where the story shifts away from physical conflict moves into reflection, not through dialogue, but through presence. The weight of everything that came before now settles into stillness. Every choice made, every system broken, every moment endured. It all exists here, compressed into one final space. And for the first time in a long time, there is no immediate direction forward. The battlefield is no longer guiding movement. There is no structure left to oppose. And that absence forces something deeper to surface. Not victory, not defeat, but understanding. Because in the absence of opposition, the meaning of everything that happened becomes unavoidable. The system that once defined the conflict is gone, but its impact remains. And that impact is not measured in destruction alone. It is measured in change. As the final silence continues, there is a subtle shift in perspective. The world that once revolved around conflict and pursuit now feels distant, almost disconnected, as if the events that unfolded belonged to a different version of reality. And in that separation, clarity begins to form, not about what was won or lost, but about what cannot return. The life before this moment no longer exists in any functional sense, not because it was destroyed, but because it has been fundamentally altered by everything that occurred. And that realization carries weight, because endings like this do not reset. They redefine. There is also an unspoken recognition that the system, despite its collapse, was never just an enemy. It was a structure built on the idea of control, of order, of preventing unpredictability. And Rambo represents the opposite of that idea, not as chaos, but as survival beyond design. And now, with no opposing force remaining, that contrast stands fully exposed. The environment itself becomes symbolic in its stillness. Every object, every space, every silent structure reflects the absence of what once defined it, and that absence is the final consequence, not of battle, but of resolution. Because every system eventually reaches a point where it must confront what it created. And in this case, it could not withstand it. As the final moments of silence continue, there is no indication of what comes next. No continuation of conflict. No new structure forming immediately in its place. Only the afterstate of everything that has already ended. And within that afterstate, Rambo remains, not as a participant in ongoing conflict, but as the final witness to its conclusion. And that is where the story begins to shift toward its ultimate final moment. Not as action, not as confrontation, but as meaning.